The Buddha's three-part protection system, how mindfulness really works. The Buddha says to make yourself an island, to make yourself a refuge. He says you do that by establishing mindfulness. Now, if you think of mindfulness as meaning just awareness, it doesn't help you very much. But then you remember that when the Buddha used the term mindfulness, he talked about it as a faculty of the memory, the act of keeping things in mind. This is where mindfulness becomes helpful, because there are values you want to keep in mind, especially as you leave the monastery and go out on your own. You have to rely on yourself to train yourself to hold the values of the Dhamma in mind, because the world is not going to hold them for you. You can use the internet to listen to Dhamma talks and to chanting, but as you go through the day, you have to carry these values around with you. The importance of your virtue, the importance of right view, things you don't want to lose. This means that when you're faced with loss of other kinds in the world, you realize that you can hold on to these things and they can't be taken away from you. People can make it difficult for you to hold by the precepts, and they can make it difficult for you to hold by right view. You're working now on the strength that can withstand those influences. If you remember to, if you keep them in mind, if you remember the values of the Dhamma, keep in mind the values of the Dhamma, then you can rely on yourself. If you forget, then you're back in the river. You've lost your island. So it's important that you learn how to keep these things in mind. It's good to start the day, every day, meditating and reflecting on the values of the Dhamma. We focus on the breath as our main topic for meditation, but you don't use that as your only topic. It's your home base. As you realize that you're facing a world where the values are very much opposed to the Dhamma, you have to reinforce your determination that you're going to stick with the Dhamma throughout the day. That requires other meditation themes as well. You start with goodwill. If you really have goodwill for yourself, goodwill for other beings, you've got to hold by your precepts and to hold by right view. Then, as the Buddha said, you have to have determination. The first determination is not to neglect discernment. What would it mean to neglect discernment? It would mean to not pay attention to the long-term consequences of your actions. Here again, it's so easy in this world, where everything is measured in quarterly or day-to-day terms, for you to think in the short term along with everyone else. And although the Buddha does recommend that you focus on the present moment, it's not for the present moment for its own sake. It's not to say, narrowly focus here. You focus on the present moment, because you know there are things in the future you've got to prepare for, and you've got to keep in mind that you need to do those things. The fact that you're going to die someday, the world wants you to forget that. They want you to focus on other things, but you've got to keep that in mind. When you die, what's going to happen? Where are you going to go? What have you prepared? This is why we have those 5 reflections. We're subject to aging, illness, and death. Subject to separation. These things are going to happen. All we have to rely on are the principles of that 5th reflection. You're the owner of your actions. Whatever you do, for good or for evil, to that will you fall heir. So what kind of legacy are you giving to yourself? What kind of will are you writing for yourself? Keep that in mind. Make that question your priority as you go through the day. That becomes your island. You have to keep reminding yourself that the long term is what's really important. There's a sutta where the Buddha is talking to the monks. They've just seen a huge fire, and he asks them, which would be better, to lie down hugging a nice young maiden, or to lie down hugging a fire? The monks play the straight man and say, oh, it'd be better to lie down hugging a maiden. The Buddha says, well, if it's a monk who's not really a monk who, in his words, is rotten and oozing inside, it would be better for him to lie down hugging the fire. That goes against a lot of our immediate knee-jerk reactions. But the Buddha's saying, think about the long term. If you lie down hugging a fire, it would cause you death or death-like pain, but it wouldn't send you to a bad destination. But if you're not good in the practice, if you've neglected the practice and you give in to sensuality and to all your other defilements, then lying down hugging a nice maiden could take you down to hell. So you have to think about these things. They are the things you have to keep in mind. When the Buddha told about the night of his awakening, in the standard version, he had 3 knowledges. Now, as he said in other places, there was a lot more that he didn't talk about. He compared what he did teach to a handful of leaves, whereas the leaves in the whole forest were like the things he learned in his awakening. He didn't tell much about what he awakened to, so the things that he did talk about had to have been important. Sometimes we think the belief in karma and rebirth can be dismissed as simply a carryover from other beliefs in his time. But if you actually look at what people had to say about karma and rebirth in his time, they were very different from what he had to say. Some people said that there was no such thing as karma, that you had no choices, or the karma wasn't even real, or all the things you choose to do wouldn't have any consequences. That was taught too. Some thought that your karma did have an influence on your rebirth. Some thought that it didn't, and some thought that there wasn't any rebirth anyhow. As for how things worked in terms of rebirth, some of the beliefs were really strange. My favorite one is the belief that when you die, you go up to the moon and you feed off the moon, which is why the moon looks so mottled, like cheese that people have been nibbling on. Eventually, you fall down as rain and you turn into a plant. And then, from that plant, it depends on who eats you or what eats you. You turn into that kind of person or animal. Really bizarre. So, when the Buddha taught that your actions are real, that they are determined by the quality of your intention, and the results are determined by the quality of your intention, and they do lead to different destinations after you die, he wasn't just picking up beliefs from his time. He taught this to remind you that these points are really important to keep in mind. That reminds me of that cartoon in The New Yorker. A group of business people are sitting around a table, and one of them is announcing, well, we've improved our percentage in the 15 to 24-year-old age group, but we've lost our immortal souls. In Buddhism, we don't talk about immortal souls, but you could say, we're headed to hell. Put that cartoon on your refrigerator and use what the Buddha said are the guardians of the world. A sense of shame and a sense of compunction. Shame. Here we're talking about the healthy sense of shame that's the opposite of shamelessness. Think about Ajahn Mun, Ajahn Lee, or the Buddha, or any of the great teachers. Think of them as watching you as you go through the day. What would they say? What would they think? Realizing that they would hold you to a high standard, but it's out of compassion. Have the sense that you would want to please them. As for compunction, again, think of the long term. Your actions are going to have consequences, and you'd rather not add to the suffering that's already there in your life. Try to keep these two qualities in mind. Keep in mind the fact that someone in this world system we live in has found the end of suffering, has found that it can be attained through human effort. The teaching of that person is still alive, and the opportunities to practice are still there. It's not the case that modern life presents difficulties. whereas life in the time of the Buddha didn't present difficulties. They had their difficulties then too. Think of King Pasenadi coming to see the Buddha. The Buddha asks him, "What have you been doing today?" The king, in a remarkable bout of frankness, replies, "Oh, the typical things of someone who's obsessed with power, trying to maintain his power." Those issues were there back in those days too. The Buddha gives him an image to hold in mind. He says, suppose someone reliable were to come from the east and say, "There's a mountain moving in from the east, crushing all beings in its path." Another reliable person coming from the south saying, "There's a mountain coming from the south, crushing all beings in its path." Another person from the west, from the north. 2 more mountains moving in from the west, from the north. 4 mountains in total moving in, crushing all beings. Given that there would be this horrendous loss of life, what would you do? The king says, "What else could I do but practice the Dhamma?" Then Buddha says, "Well, I warn you, great king. Aging, illness, and death are moving in, crushing all beings in their path. So what are you going to do?" The king says, "What else should I do but practice the Dhamma?" And that's a king speaking. So keep that in mind. These mountains are moving in. How they move in on you, the details of how it happens, is not as nearly as important as the question of what you're doing to prepare. Knowing that you're going to have to give up this life at some point, what are you going to take with you? What have you prepared for the next life? The Buddha says, if you've done good, then that goodness will greet you as you come to the other side, like relatives greeting a relative of theirs who has long gone away, coming back home. The verse that says that keeps repeating, "Home, home, home. You're coming home to your good deeds." As for your bad deeds, it'll be a different welcome, a harsh one. So try to keep these things in mind. This is the kind of mindfulness that becomes your refuge, your island, something you can really depend on. But it requires an effort on your part, because the values of the world are screaming in your ears, flashing in front of your eyes, and you've got to resist. So remember, you're here for a short sojourn, and you want to survive this sojourn. You want to survive with your goodness intact. Not only intact, but also plentiful. In that way, you can leave some goodness behind for the rest of the world, and be assured that it's going to go with you as well. Keep that in mind. Protection through mindfulness practice. The Buddha often talks about the practice of satipatthana, or the establishing of mindfulness, as a kind of protection. He says that you make yourself a refuge when you practice the establishing of mindfulness. You make yourself an island, a safe place in the middle of the flood. There's also the passage where he tells the story of 2 acrobats. As each acrobat maintains his or her own sense of balance, each is protecting him or herself, and also provides a protection for the other. This too, the Buddha then says, is an analogy for the establishing of mindfulness. So, what kind of protection does mindfulness provide? Here it's useful to note that when the Buddha talked about the duties of a teacher, one of them is to provide protection for the student in all directions. In his own case, this meant that he gave the student clear reasons for what should and shouldn't be done, lessons that the student could take along wherever he'd go, and that would be valid in whatever direction he went. After all, we go through life active, not passive. We're shaping our experience, so we need guidance as to what ways will provide us with happiness in the long term and help us avoid suffering in the long term. The main danger in life is our own lack of knowledge in this area, or even worse, believing that our actions don't matter or have no results. That's really dangerous. A lot more dangerous than the dangers other people can pose to us. So this question of protection has to apply to what you're doing with your mind right now. This is where the establishing of mindfulness provides a really good protection, because when we look at the three qualities that go into establishing mindfulness, ardency, alertness, and mindfulness, we can see that they're not just matters of accepting or resigning ourselves to whatever comes up. They give guidance as to what to do, right here, right now. Mindfulness is what keeps in mind the ability to recognize things, the labels we have for naming things as they come up in the present moment. That's the first step. The second step is that once you've recognized what something is, mindfulness reminds you of what should or shouldn't be done with it. It reminds you not only what you've read in the text or heard from teachers, but also what you've learned on your own in your practice, as to what works and what doesn't work in giving rise to skillful qualities. That's how your power of memory is a protector. Then there's alertness. Alertness watches what's actually happening, and in particular, what you're doing and the results you're getting from what you're doing. You might say that it takes note of what's happening and then sends the information over to mindfulness. Mindfulness then recognizes what's going on and gives instruction as for what should be done. If something is unskillful and you recognize it as something unskillful, then you remember that it's something you've got to get rid of, and you try to remember how. And finally, ardency is what does what should be done. So these three qualities working together all provide you with your own protection, and their interaction goes further. Once ardency has done something well, alertness notes that. When it's done something not so well, alertness will note that too. Then you send that information off to mindfulness to remember. So you want to strengthen these qualities as much as you can, because if you're missing any of them, you're left without protection. Each of them provides protection in its own particular way. For example, in some cases, you may not be able to recognize if something is skillful or not. You can't recognize what's happening. And in this case, your protection is to be really, really alert. That means that you have to watch it for a while. As in Ajahn Mun's advice to Ajahn Mahabua, if something comes up in your meditation and you're not sure about it, watch it. Stay with that sense of awareness, the observer, the knower, and don't be too quick to come to any conclusions until you can see what's actually happening. Ultimately, you'll recognize it as something skillful or unskillful, something to be developed or something to be abandoned. But be careful not to jump too quickly to conclusions. That's alertness over the long term. There are also the times when alertness has to be very quick, as in Upasika Key's advice. When something comes up in the meditation that seems really good, or an insight comes up that's really compelling, note what happens immediately after that. In other words, you've got to be alert continuously. You can't go riding with a sense of, say, pride, or a sense of total conviction in the insight. Look for cause and effect in the very act of having an insight. Try to see what happens as a result of believing that insight. So, there are times when alertness provides protection by being long-term, and other times when it provides protection by being very quick. You really can't lack any of these three qualities. If you forget what you've learned from the past, you're totally defenseless. At the same time, if you know what should be done, but you don't carry it through, then you're not really protecting yourself either. So you have to work on all these three qualities together. One main problem is that when something comes up in the mind, we tend to think of it in terms of our own vocabulary. Lust comes up, and our vocabulary says that it's something good. Anger comes up, and even though part of us may think that it's not all that good, another part of us really likes it. This is why mindfulness, remembering the Buddha's vocabulary for these things, has to be strong. It enables you to recognize when there's something that, for the sake of the practice, you don't want to follow, and it reminds you of the tools you have to deal with it. When lust comes up, for instance, the mind can create all kinds of reasons for why the object of lust is really attractive. You've got to remember to recognize it as a hindrance, and to recall that if you follow through with it, it's going to create a lot of trouble. Among the tools that mindfulness can use to help you here is the ability to remember that lust has its dangers. Here, it's good to think of all the stupid things people do under the power of lust, and the awful situations they get themselves into. Getting tied down to a person they thought was attractive, and then discovering what else there is in that person. The person's background, personality, family, all the connections that come bundled with that person. That helps you realize how risky it is. When this really hits home, you'll be a little more likely to want to actually apply that meditation in the chant right now on the different parts of the body. First, think about your own body. What's in there that's really worthy of lust? Take out all the parts and examine them to see which of them could be really attractive. Only then do you apply the same contemplation to the other person, which is what makes it fair. In other words, you're not saying that the other gender or the other person is the bad one. Your body, too, has the same sort of stuff. But as the Buddha says, this analysis is going to work only if you have an alternative source of pleasure. This is why we work with the breath. The two contemplations have to go together. All too often, when you're really tired or stressed out, you say to yourself that the pleasure that comes from the lust is really worth it. It's something you really need. You want your quick fix. But if you can take a few minutes to stop and just breathe in a way that's really refreshing, really nourishing, you give yourself some relief, you give yourself some strength, you give yourself some food, and then that enables you to say to yourself, actually, I don't really need that other kind of pleasure after all. This is why ardency in developing concentration can be your first line protection against lust. As the Buddha said, you can know all the drawbacks of sensuality, but if you don't have an alternative form of pleasure, all that knowledge is worthless. So ardency here also has to develop concentration, a sense of non-sensual well-being, working with the breath. We've talked for the last couple of days in the Q&A about different ways of working with the breath energy, and it's important to take some time to explore this aspect of your relationship to your body. What kind of movement of the breath is actually helpful? What kind of movement of the breath makes it more difficult to stay with the body? And learn to play. Take the breath energy in the body as your playground here, and be open to new ideas about how the breath energy can move. You'll notice in Ajahn Lee's basic instructions that he talks about the breath energy going down the spine and down the legs as you breathe in. But it can also do that as you breathe out. There are other times when he talks about the breath energy starting in the soles of the feet, coming up the legs and up the spine in the other direction. You may read in manuals on Tai Chi that there's an energy circle running from the navel down to the spot between the legs and then back up the spine and down the front of the torso to the navel. But in your own case, you may find that as you breathe in, a certain part of the energy can run a circle that goes up the front and down the back, or up the back and down the front, whichever way you want the energy to go. There are lots of different ways you can work with the energy. Don't limit yourself. The more variety you can find in dealing with the breath, the more intriguing it will be to stay with the body, and the more you'll be able to find a sense of well-being for the body, giving it just what it needs at any particular time. This allows you to step back, say, from your anger or lust, and look at the other physical and mental symptoms that you've put together to create that lustful or angry state to begin with. After all, these are things that we fabricate. We're really good at putting them together. A little sensation here, a little sensation there. You tie them together, and there you are. Lust is overcoming you. It's laid claim to your body and to your mind. You've suddenly got all that pressure inside that you've got to do something about. The same with anger. This person did that and that and that. And then you can stitch all the that's together into a big story, and it gets your blood boiling. There was a report recently about how people with strong bouts of anger are more likely to have a heart attack a couple of hours later. The researchers said they didn't know what the connection was, although it's pretty obvious. We stitch all these things together, and then all the stitched together parts block the energy flow. Pressure builds up, and something explodes. All it takes is a little random sensation here and there, and the mind has learned how to be really good at stitching them into a web to catch itself. We've been doing this for who knows how many lifetimes, but if you have a sense of well-being with the breath, then you can step back from these fabrications. You begin to take them apart, to cut through all the connections you've created. Ask yourself, what was the first sensation in the body? What was the first little thought in the mind? The little whisper of thought that suggested that lust might be a good antidote for whatever sense of irritation you're feeling, or that anger would be an appropriate response for what someone's done. And how does that work its way through your inner bureaucracy, influencing this person, that person inside, all those committee members working together, creating little sensations here and there, and all of a sudden, you've got a full-blown case. If you want to believe their propaganda when that happens, you're throwing away your protection. Your protection is to remind yourself, this is an unskillful state, and you have to be alert. One of the things you remember with mindfulness is that if you stay with the body, or in particular, stay with the breath, you're going to be here in the present moment. That way, when these things happen, you'll see them in time, and you'll be alert to upcoming trends. If you see that things are going in a bad direction, you can turn them around. This is how these three qualities keep spinning around the mind and the body, working to give you the protection you need from things like lust, aversion, delusion, greed, all the unskillful things that come welling up inside that you've been so good at creating, and that creates so many dangers for yourself. This is why, when Ajahn Lee was writing about the establishing of mindfulness, he kept hammering away at these three qualities: mindfulness, alertness, ardency. Mindfulness, alertness, ardency. They lie at the essence of how the establishing of mindfulness can provide you with a protection and be your refuge, your island in the middle of the river. Or, as they say in another passage in the canon, your island in the middle of a lake. The lake is rising, but you've got this island that provides you with a refuge so that you don't have to drown in the lake. So don't abandon it. Think of that image of the quail being hunted by a hawk. As long as the quail stays in its safe territory, the hawk can't get it. But as soon as it wanders out, there's no guarantee. And what does it mean to wander out of your safe territory? To get fascinated with sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, all the raw materials for things like passion and aversion. If you do that, the hawk can get you. But if you stay in your proper territory, the establishing of mindfulness, you're safe. Of course, it's not just a place. It's also a combination of activities here in the mind. They're your protectors, so nourish them well.